A storm howls across the Mongolian steppe, tearing through the endless night. Inside a vast tent, silk banners whip against wooden poles, shadows bending with each flicker of candlelight. At the center lies a man the world calls invincible, Genghis Khan, conqueror of kingdoms, breaker of nations. Thousands of women have passed through this chamber, taken, inspected, broken, and discarded like livestock. Yet tonight, one of them moves differently. Draped in embroidered sleeves, her trembling hand curls around a hidden blade, cold steel pressing against her palm. The predator who built an empire on the screams of others does not stir. Outside, thunder rolls. Inside, the greatest conqueror in history is about to learn what it feels like to be prey. History remembers his empire of blood, but in reality, it was built on something far darker. Genghis Khan, to the world, his name means victory. The man who united fractured tribes and redrew the borders of empires with fire and steel. His armies rode further and faster than any before him, leaving nations reduced to ash in their wake. But what lies beneath this legend is a truth history rarely tells. This is not a story of military genius, but of a hidden system, a machinery of sexual terror. Thousands of women taken from burning cities, sorted like spoils of war, transformed into tools of empire. Soldiers rewarded with flesh, commanders gifted noble captives, entire populations rewritten through forced bloodlines. His conquest was not only of land but of bodies, and yet, among the countless silenced voices, one would rise, a girl who turned the machinery of despair into the whisper of revenge. The boy who would become Genghis Khan was not born into greatness. His name was Temujin, and his childhood was carved out of hunger, betrayal, and fear. The Mongolian steppe was no place for the weak, a land of endless horizons, where survival belonged only to those willing to crush others beneath their boots. Yet, for all its harshness, Temujin found a fragile sense of peace in one person, Borte. She was not only his bride but his anchor. In her eyes, Temujin glimpsed something no warrior's blade could offer: loyalty, affection, a promise of stability in a world that constantly threatened to collapse around him. But fate was merciless. The Merkits, enemies bound by old feuds, descended on their camp. Like wolves, they tore through the night, stealing what mattered most to Temujin. Borte was dragged away, screaming into the dark, her figure vanishing into the black maw of the steppe. For days she was gone, held captive, humiliated, and returned with a pregnancy that may not have been her husband's. That wound would never heal. Temujin raised an army not only to reclaim her, but to reclaim himself. The boy who once loved became a man who could never again trust. The humiliation gnawed at him, whispering in the back of his skull that he was powerless once and could be again. So he transformed. The hunger for vengeance consumed him. When he struck back at the Merkits, it was not a battle, it was an erasure. Men, women, children, entire families butchered without hesitation. Temujin's rage was not satisfied by their blood. Their destruction was meant to echo, to remind the world that no one could touch what was his without paying in screams and ashes. But even in victory, he found no relief. Killing them was not enough. The torment of Bertie's captivity haunted him. Her silence in the nights, the questions that gnawed. Was their firstborn truly his? Did she still see the faces of her captors when she closed her eyes? These thoughts poisoned him. They twisted love into obsession, trust into control. And in that darkness, a new idea took root. If his enemies had wounded him through Bertie, then he would wound his enemies the same way. Not with the sword, but with something deeper, with the theft of dignity, the breaking of families, the rewriting of bloodlines. For the first time, Temujin saw the power not only of conquest, but of humiliation. The raids became ritual. Captured women were not spared. They were trophies, instruments of vengeance. What Bertie endured would be replicated 1,000 times, across tribes, across nations. The shame that once belonged to him alone would now be scattered like seeds into every enemy lineage. The boy who lost his wife had become the man who would define conquest through women's suffering. And so the foundations of his empire were set, not only in steel and horses, but in systematic cruelty. As Temujin stared out across the steppe, the fires of Merkit still smoldering behind him, he realized something chilling. Death was too merciful. His enemies must live, broken, tainted, remade in his image. The conquest of flesh had begun, and from that single wound, one stolen bride, one seed of humiliation, the machinery of sexual terror would be born. What started as personal vengeance would soon grow into policy, into infrastructure, into the darkest bureaucracy the world had ever seen. Conquest, in the hands of most rulers, meant land and wealth. But for Temujin, now Genghis Khan, conquest became something far more intimate. Every raid, every siege, Every burning village became a theater of humiliation, and women stood at the center of his strategy. The steppe had taught him that survival was not only about killing, it was about breaking spirits. To slaughter a man was to silence him, but to take his wife, his daughter, his sister, and claim them before his eyes was to crush him while leaving him alive. That was the lesson of Berthé's abduction, twisted and weaponized into a philosophy of empire. And so Genghis Khan built not only an army, but a machine of reproductive terror. Women were catalogued like livestock. After a battle, the spoils were divided: horses, weapons, and then the women. The most beautiful and youthful were reserved for the Khan himself, a perverse privilege of power. Others were handed out to generals and soldiers as rewards. In this way, loyalty to Genghis was reinforced not just through gold or status, but through access to flesh. What had begun as Temujin's personal vengeance metastasized into systematic policy. Within the encampments of his empire, women became the silent currency of conquest. Entire bloodlines were extinguished as men were slaughtered, and their women absorbed into the Mongol ranks. The act was not only about lust, it was about legacy. By forcing his enemies' women to bear Mongol children, he rewrote the very fabric of nations. Children born from violence carried the blood of their conquerors, binding tribes to him whether they willed it or not. To resist was futile. A woman who rejected him or his men was not only punished with death, often she was made a spectacle. Accounts whisper of women tied to posts, publicly defiled before the remnants of their tribes, their suffering transformed into a lesson carved into the memory of survivors. Terror was the true weapon, and women were its vessels. The Khan himself was notorious for claiming wives and daughters of defeated rulers. Beauty was a curse in his world, for it drew his eye, and once his gaze fell upon a woman, her fate was sealed. A captured princess could expect not only to become his concubine, but to serve as a living trophy of her people's defeat. She was a reminder that resistance was useless, that even royalty could be reduced to breeding stock, and the machinery did not stop with him. His sons and generals learned well. The pattern repeated across cities, kingdoms, and continents. Where Mongol banners rose, women disappeared, absorbed into harems, forced into servitude, or left broken in the dust. For the Mongols, war and rape were inseparable, two blades of the same sword. In time, the scope of this horror defied comprehension. Whole populations bore the genetic imprint of their conqueror. Modern science whispers the echo of this past. Millions across Asia and beyond carry traces of his lineage, the haunting proof of systematic violation woven into human DNA. But in the age of Genghis, this was not legacy, it was domination. Behind the stories of great battles and cavalry charges lies a quieter, darker truth. His empire was not only built on the bones of his enemies, but on the wombs of their women. Every city sacked, every tribe broken, carried the unspoken threat: your women will become ours. Your children will no longer be yours. Your bloodline ends tonight. This was conquest at its most primal, conquest that erased history and remade it in flesh. And yet this was only the beginning. For if women were instruments of his power, then Genghis Khan himself became the embodiment of an even greater terror, a man whose appetites knew no limits, and whose shadow stretched across generations. The empire was not just ruled by him, it was seated by him. At the center of the whirlwind stood one man, not just a warlord, not merely a conqueror, but a force of nature whose shadow loomed over empires. Genghis Khan was not content to rule with armies and laws. He sought to leave his mark in flesh, in blood, in the generations yet unborn. To his followers he was the eternal wolf. To his enemies he was the end of the world. To the women who fell into his grasp he was something far worse, an inescapable sentence. History remembers him as the father of nations, but the reality is far more chilling. He was the emperor of flesh. The stories whisper of the nights after conquest. While the city smoldered and corpses lay unburied, the Khan would retire into silken tents, surrounded by trembling captives. For him, desire was never separate from destruction. To claim a woman was to finish what the sword had begun. She was not simply a prize, she was the last echo of a conquered people, a living fragment he could bend to his will. It is said he took wives and concubines by the hundreds, perhaps the thousands. The tent of the great Khan was never without new faces, young women seized from every corner of the known world, Chinese princesses, Persian maidens, daughters of Russian nobles. To be beautiful was to be doomed. They were brought before him as offerings, their families dead, their futures erased, and within those walls the Khan's will became law. Consent was not even a concept. Resistance was swallowed by terror, crushed beneath the weight of inevitability. But unlike the fleeting lust of ordinary men, Genghis's obsession was rooted in something larger. To him, each woman was a vessel, a womb to carry forward his blood. His children would be everywhere, his name written not only in chronicles but in the veins of countless descendants. It was empire-making in its most grotesque form, not through stone monuments or laws, but through forced intimacy, through generations born of conquest, and he was not subtle about it. The taking of women was a public ritual of humiliation. By forcing the wives and daughters of defeated rulers into his bed, he transformed their lineage into his own. Kings who once ruled proudly were reduced to ashes as their bloodline was devoured by his seed. To sleep with the daughter of a king was not pleasure alone, it was sovereignty made flesh. It was proof that he and he alone stood above all rulers, all nations, all men. Yet the horror did not end at his tent flap. The Khan's hunger for dominance spread outward, trickling down through his generals, his soldiers, his empire. His sons carried his habits like an inheritance, carving harems of their own, perpetuating a cycle of terror that spanned continents. To be conquered by the Mongols was not simply to lose land, it was to have your women consumed by a system where flesh was a weapon, a trophy and a symbol. Even allies were not spared. Princesses promised as diplomatic brides often found themselves swallowed into his harem, their marriages annulled by force, their roles rewritten as concubines. Some accounts suggest that even women meant for his sons were claimed first by the Khan himself, as if to remind them all that nothing, not even family, could escape his appetite. And yet there was a deeper darkness still, for in the heart of his ambition lay a vision of immortality. Death could not frighten him, because his essence would live on in the thousands of children scattered across the lands. Each woman he took became a fragment of that dream. He was not only building an empire of stone and steel, he was planting himself in the very DNA of humanity. The horror then was not just for the women who endured his nights, but for the generations condemned to carry his blood. To this day, millions bear the genetic trace of a man who turned violation into legacy. It is history's cruelest irony. His cruelty survived him more faithfully than any monument. But if this was the private face of his empire, lust, humiliation, and terror made flesh, then the world was yet to see the scale of devastation he would unleash. For as his empire expanded, so too did his appetite, and with it came atrocities that blurred the line between war and apocalypse. The fire of Genghis Khan's life eventually dimmed, but the echoes of his appetite did not fade with his death. If anything, the shadow grew longer. His empire fractured into khanates, yet his bloodline stretched across every border like veins running through the body of the earth itself. What he left behind was not just territory carved by swords, it was a legacy carved into flesh, into the wombs of women, into the lineage of nations. Historians estimate that 1 in every 200 men alive today carries his genetic signature. Pause on that for a moment. One man, through conquest and violation, stamped his presence onto the DNA of millions. He built not just an empire of land, but an empire of blood. Unlike the marble monuments of Rome or the cathedrals of Europe, this monument is alive, beating inside the chests of ordinary people who will never know it. His immortality was not carved in stone, it was written in skin. But with this so-called immortality came a darkness that no empire could conceal. For every descendant that bore his blood, there were countless women who had no choice in giving it. Entire generations were stripped of autonomy, reduced to vessels in a system where power was measured in bodies, where the female form was turned into both battlefield and trophy. His sons and grandsons, raised in this brutal mold, carried the practice forward. The Mongol dynasty became a dynasty of flesh, where harems rivaled armies in size, and where royal blood was diluted, consumed, and remade in his image. Yet outside the intimate horror, his sexual legacy shaped civilizations. In Persia, Russia, and China, dynasties were upended not only by war but by forced unions. The children of Genghis's unions sometimes rose to thrones, while others vanished into obscurity, forgotten except for the torment that birthed them. Some historians argue this blending of blood helped unify distant peoples under Mongol rule, stitching together East and West. But what is unity when it is built on screams, when it is bought with the destruction of choice? His sexual conquests also became a form of political terror. For centuries, rulers invoked his name with dread, not only as the destroyer of cities but as the taker of wives. In chronicles, the fear is palpable. Men did not only fear losing their kingdoms to his armies, they feared their lineage would be consumed, that their bloodline would vanish into his harem, replaced by a dynasty that bore only the mark of the wolf. And so Genghis Khan became more than a man, he became a symbol. To his people he was the eternal conqueror, the founder of an empire that stretched farther than Alexander's. To his victims he was a nightmare that did not end with death, a shadow that lived on in the veins of their descendants. His greatness cannot be separated from his cruelty. They were one and the same. Centuries later, science would prove what history already whispered. Geneticists uncovered the truth. Millions alive today carry his Y chromosome, a living testimony to how empire was written into flesh. It is the most intimate empire ever built, one that no war can destroy, one that no history book can erase. And with every child born carrying that invisible signature, the horror of his methods is reborn. This is the ultimate paradox of Genghis Khan, a man who destroyed entire civilizations, yet ensured his own survival by weaving himself into humanity itself. His armies may be gone, his cities turned to dust, but in bloodlines he is eternal. Every descendant carries both the mark of his victory and the echo of his violence. And so the question remains, was this immortality, this empire of flesh, his final triumph, or his final curse? History likes to place Genghis Khan in the realm of conquerors. He is compared to Caesar, to Alexander, to Napoleon. But what sets him apart is not simply the land he claimed. It is the intimacy of his conquest. He did not just plant banners on foreign soil, he planted his seed in foreign wombs. His empire was not only made of fortresses, roads, and soldiers, it was made of bodies, bound by fear, by submission, and by blood. Today, scientists can map his legacy not by the ruins of his capital, not by the bones scattered across Eurasian battlefields, but by the DNA of living men. Millions unknowingly carry within them the unbroken line of the Mongol horde. They do not carry the memory of war, nor the cries of those who suffered, but the blood remembers, even when the mind does not. Every new generation becomes part of the monument he left behind, a living archive of conquest written into chromosomes. And yet, when we strip away the myths of greatness, what remains is horror. Behind every descendant was a woman who had no choice. Behind every branch of this bloodline is a broken life, a silence forced upon someone who could not resist the will of the Khan. His immortality is therefore not triumph alone, it is tragedy multiplied across centuries, tragedy that has been sanitized into legend, dressed up in admiration for empire, and forgotten in the shadow of his supposed genius. But blood does not lie. It carries both the weight of survival and the stain of violence. His story forces us to confront a question that is as old as humanity itself. When does legacy become curse? When does survival mean complicity and horror? Perhaps that is why the figure of Genghis Khan still unsettles us. His face carved into monuments, his name invoked as a symbol of strength, and yet his true monument is invisible, pulsing through the veins of millions who never asked to be part of it. His conquest never truly ended, it simply changed form. In the end, his empire of flesh may be the most haunting one ever built. Empires of stone fall to dust, empires of maps fade into new borders, but an empire of blood endures, carried in silence by those who never chose it, and maybe that is the cruelest truth of all.